2, 1, welcome in. Introduction to word problems. When you're going to be in school and you're going to be taking math or sciences, to be honest with you, many other courses as you go along, things like business, for example, healthcare, it doesn't actually matter. You're going to have to at some point take the stuff that you've learned in math, so take the tools that you had from all the additions, subtractions, multiplications, divisions, exponents, all of those wonderful things, they actually play a role in trying to solve some applications. Some people do it for fun, to try to solve some equations or something like that. But ultimately, we want to try to solve problems. This is how our computers came about. This is how we can build a chair, a table, a house, and so on. Because we take the tools that math has given us and then we just apply it to real life. Now, when you're just being introduced to word problems in general, I'm sure you're going to run into many word problems or many applications, all the way, from elementary school onwards. But there is some kind of a systematic way that you might want to think about word problems. Unfortunately, because there are so many, we can't kind of pigeonhole all the word problems into one particular structure. But there is kind of a set where you can have almost like a blanket, checklist of items just to remind you what to think about if you're stuck on a particular word problem. And that's what I want to do in this video, okay? So pretty much any word problem related to math and sciences or business or something of that nature is going to boil down to trying to solve for something. So the ultimate question that students should run into is they should be asking themselves, what am I trying to solve for? Trying to solve for. So that's the kind of ultimate question. What am I trying to solve for? Now, this question actually boils down to one particular answer, because no matter how lengthy a word problem in math or sciences or somewhere else might be, you will find that there's going to be one item that you're going to be trying to particularly solve for. So this question of, solving for something will boil down for you, and the answer will be, what is the quantity? What is the quantity that I'm trying to solve for? Now, this quantity is something which is measurable in some way, or maybe countable in some way. And there are many different quantities that you're going to run into. And when you're solving a word problem, you're going to want to try to see and pick out from the actual word problem, what is that quantity that they're asking me about? And I'll show you kind of the major examples of quantities in just a moment. And now the second question, once you know what the quantity is, once you know what it might be, so I'll give you one example. Let's say maybe you're trying to solve for distance. Now you're going to have to ask yourself, okay, so that particular distance has many different measurement units that it can be. So distance can possibly be measured in meters, it can be measured in feet, it can be measured in inches, it can be measured in centimeters, kilometers, miles, so on. So that will depend on the application. If it's something very small, maybe you're measuring it in centimeters or inches, or maybe even smaller, maybe millimeters. But if something is much bigger, like distances between cities, you might be measuring it in kilometers or miles. So now the question is, okay, so I know what I'm solving for, so maybe I'm solving for distance. And now what units am I going to use? So what measuring units will I have? Okay, what scale will I be using? So that scale is basically units. So the second question that you should be asking yourself is, what units, and these are measuring units, so what units, okay, or what scaling should I use in this particular question? And that, again, so it boils down, I'm going to highlight it for us here in blue, so it will be kind of units in general that we want to look for. And these two items are going to be your starting points that you will have. So I would kind of write here for you. So if it was, for instance, you are reading some particular question, and then at the end they'll say, so what distance was actually traveled? So now this would have been your quantity that you have. And then you have to figure out what units. And then so maybe if it's distance traveled, maybe it's going to be kilometers. So clearly, as I'm going through this video, I am making a little bit of an assumption that, you're not necessarily maybe in grade 1 or 2, where these concepts kind of have to stick and you have to try them over and over. My assumption is, probably a little bit later on in grades, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, or maybe even post-secondary, who knows? But these are the two things you're always going to run into in every single word problem in math that you have. So now let's take a look at these two items, these quantities and these units. And then when I write them out for you, they'll be in a table. I'll highlight them for you. You will see that many of these quantities, so these quantities, things that we can measure with an actual, and put a number on them, are things that you probably have heard of. And if there are things that you haven't heard of, you probably might learn them much, much later on in your math or sciences or something else career. But the first initial ones, we hear of these words quite often. So it's much easier to be able to comprehend them and get some intuition. So here I'm going to present to you kind of a table that you have. So these are quantities and units, okay, so that you see here on the screen. And by the way, if you want this particular handout, what I'm going to do is you can click on the show notes below and I'll put a link and you can just download this as a PDF file for yourself if you want to try to keep it. But I'm sure on the internet, you can find many tables like this. These ones are not fully out complete because there are many quantities. I tried to give you some more common ones. So for instance, if you're going to be asking yourself in a question, what will it be that you're going to be solving for, which is really this quantity that you have in here. Here you have a list, okay, of all of these different quantities that you have. Now, this particular quantities, okay, so distance, for example, is something that people are aware of, right? It's the length, okay, so from one point to another that you have. Now, that distance can involve many other quantities which are kind of encapsulated in it. So, for example, if you're measuring height, it's still a distance, but I guess it's a vertical distance. So, you can say height. You can also say width or depth. Okay, so all of those are actually distances. So I just kept them under one umbrella here, but you can make them specific if you want to. Now, every single quantity in math and sciences, eventually you don't want to be writing out the full word for it because you want to be able to put it in some kind of maybe an equation or an expression. So you want to truncate things. And for that reason, we typically have symbols for these particular quantities. Most of the time, I would say 95% or maybe more, we try in sciences and to take these particular symbols and make them unique to that quantity. So you will notice that as you look on the left-hand side for the quantity, so the actual full out written out names, the actual quantity symbols will be differentiated. It's very rare that they might have something as another quantity. Sometimes it happens. Actually, on this list there will be one, but most likely you won't really study that, maybe unless you get into engineering or something of that nature. So what are these quantities? Well, have we heard of distance? Yeah, we probably have. Again, I'm making assumption you're kind of in grade 7 or 8 or onwards. Have you heard of mass? Okay, have you heard of time? So, these are very common things that we hear about. So we have some intuition into them. I'm not saying that you have to know the full out definition of those, so typically they're defined maybe like in a physics course way down the line. But in terms of using them, we should be able to identify and know what these are, at least intuitively. So notice that, again, the symbols are kind of on the right here, and then the actual full out name is on the left. And you have things like temperature, right? Again, so something that we know. Notice that temperature and time, so if you look here, the symbols, so they're both T, but one is a small t and then one is a capital T. And you will have to get used to that as you keep kind of going along, because if you use capital T, typically people will think that it's temperature and it's not time. And now, you have amount of substance, for instance, so maybe if you're studying chemistry, so we typically might say that it's A, all right? And then, you might be counting something, so number of, let's say, I don't know, carrots, number of computers, number of people, okay? So that's why I put in brackets something, okay? So we can certainly count. We can see if something is accelerating, which means just it's speeding up or it's slowing down in some particular way. So that is designated, notice, also with a small a, just like the amount of substance above it. So as I said, it's not always unique, okay? But in terms of the context of the word problem, it should be pretty unique. And then you have speed or velocity there. So, I typically try to use just a small v. There is some distinction between speed and velocity. Okay, again, it will depend on your application. But most people know when you're referring to speed because we walk, we run, we use our cars. So we have some concept of that. And then, the concept of area, very often it might be some kind of a surface area. Like I have a surface, okay, within. So my face has a surface, the table has a surface. So we want to know how big that surface is. I don't know, maybe, you're studying something like lung capacity. You might want to know the interior surface of your lungs, okay, or something of that nature. Okay, and then you have volume, all right? You have density. So density is a little tricky, and most likely if you get to that, whoever it is that you are studying with, they might explain density to you. But areas and volumes, you should be kind of familiar with. Then you have this major one, which is called a rate. And for rates, it's interesting because these particular rates, they come in numerous forms. And, so for that rate, I actually made a little comment here, right here. So if you download this for yourself, you can read it. So you'll notice that rates, they encompass many different quantity combinations. So for instance, in healthcare, you might have volume flow rate, and that might be coming from an IV, for instance, in like milliliters per hour, okay? So how much volume is actually that patient receiving, or maybe mass flow rate. There's also rates in business that you might have, or in personal life, if you're talking about a mortgage rate, so what is the percentage of money that you have to pay on an annual basis for your mortgage? You might talk about hourly rates, which are, something, maybe you're working a job. So that's going to be a rate in terms of how much money you make, let's say maybe per hour. There are rates in exercising. I don't know, maybe you're on a stationary bike and you want to know how many calories you have burned in a certain amount of time. So maybe per hour or whatever, or per minute or something of that nature. And so all of these rates, okay, when we see those quantities of rates, they are most of the time something which is changing with respect to time. So it is how fast or how quickly something is being done or is being used up in some particular way, or is made in some way. For instance, if you're making $22 an hour, well, that just tells you that every hour you're going to be making $22 as long as you're obviously working. If a patient is receiving, let's say, 10 milliliters in an hour, so that means that that's how much volume would flow out in an hour. So rates are typically, not all the time, but most of the time, they're related towards time in some way. Now, what other quantities you might be solving for in these word problems? Well, maybe energy, right? So how much energy we have used, how much energy we need, how much energy we have consumed, maybe from food. Okay, so that's something you might be calculating. Maybe you're calculating force. All right, so then force is basically, how much of a push or a pull you're doing. So that's typically measured in terms of, and calculated in terms of force. Maybe frequencies. I don't know, so frequency, so how quickly something is happening in terms of cycles per second, okay? Or maybe a common one is your heart rate, okay, which might be in beats per minute, So that is actually a frequency. That's how quickly your heart is actually working out. And notice that frequency is a little bit kind of like a rate as well. And then you might have other ones like power and pressure and so on. Now, when you're initially starting and you're looking at this chart, you certainly might get overwhelmed because you might think, wow, there are so many. Do I have to remember them? Remember that at the end of the day, you most likely will look up most of these things. But the best way to learn about the quantities is actually to do word problems and struggle through them and see where they come up. And wherever it is that you're studying, at some point you're going to be running into these word problems. And they're not going to be throwing all of the quantities at you at one time. They're going to probably kind of take a subset of these quantities and only work on those few so that you kind of learn how to break down these word problems and then see how you're going to apply them. The other part is, because we've asked the question in every word problem, okay, so what is it am I solving for? So it's going to be one of the quantities. You can use a symbol for those quantities, so it makes it much easier for you in terms of setting it up. But then the other part is like, what unit of measure will you use, right? Like what scaling unit will you use? So for instance, for distance, so notice on the right-hand side in the table, I put numerous units. They're not all the units. I actually put a little 2 stars there, okay, on top. And, so right here, those 2 stars, they appear. Okay, and this table, it says it's incomplete. Okay, and it's incomplete because the truth is there are many quantities and there's also many units that you can have. That's why I put ... behind every unit, because there might be many others that you can use depending on your application. But the common ones are here that you most likely will run into. So distance, so things like meters or centimeters, millimeters. And notice these are symbols. I didn't write them out in full. Okay, so feet and inches and miles. And sometimes if you see one, you might have to see, oh, you know what, I forgot what this one means, and you can look it up. Okay, and I've done that for every single kind of quantity that you have in here, so you can kind of scan through them. But the main idea will be is that, well, when you solve for these quantities, your answers and the calculations you make are going to involve units. And that's something that I wanted to provide and remind you of in this particular video. All right. So now that we have, okay, these quantities in front of us, we have the symbols that we might use, and we have units, okay, to designate whichever quantities we might do. Now it might boil down to, I said that there might be some kind of a little bit of a checklist that you can have to try to approach certain word problems. And for majority of the word problems, this will work. But of course, as you get higher and higher, and maybe the word problems or applications become harder and harder, even a checklist is not always as easy. But this checklist that I'll show you is going to be a reminder for you to know what to think about as you break down a word problem. All right. Now, before I show you this checklist, it isn't as crucial. I don't really care as much, okay, as students use this. So even if I'm teaching physics or something like that, okay. But I guess one of the standards is that quantity symbols are typically written in italics, okay. So notice that these are in italics for symbols. And then the unit symbols are not. So the unit symbols are typically just regular Roman fonts that you have. So you can keep that in mind, but that will depend on how picky your teachers might be. All right, so here's the checklist that I have for you. You can take a screenshot of this. You can do whatever it is that you like. But I wanted to provide this checklist, so I kind of separated these things. And these are the things I think about when I approach a word problem. Now, if you do enough word problems, you're going to kind of ingrain this within your mind. And this checklist is going to automatically show up. But when you're just starting or whenever you're struggling, sometimes it's good to go back and see, okay, what's kind of step 1? What should I think about? So when I take a word problem, the first thing that I think about is I typically will think about, okay, as I mentioned, what is it am I trying to solve for? What quantity is it? And I'll try to read the word problem and then find that exact thing that they're asking me for. They might say, find the distance or the amount of energy or something like that. So that's what I'm looking for. So I'm really looking for, which one of these quantities. So in this first column that we have, what are they trying to find? Again, maybe, that quantity might not be here. Might be something that, your teachers express to you, but it will be that, first item that I always ask about. Now, why do I do that? The reason for that is because it guides me, tells me, and gives me some sense of comfort of knowing that, that's what I'm going to be solving for. I don't know how I'm going to solve for it yet, but it's good to know what it is that I'm trying to find. And then I always think about the units. I always think, so what is it that I'm going to be measuring this in? So I don't know, maybe it's something much simpler than what we had on the list. Maybe you're solving for some kind of a cost. And then the units are going to be, so maybe they're in dollars. So that's the next thing that I think about, and I can sometimes maybe write it to myself or make a kind of a memory bank of it. Those are going to be the first two items that I'm going to try to check off when I walk through a word problem. So one mistake that students make is they try to solve the problem right away instead of just saying, here it is. Let me just read it through, find what it is that I'm trying to solve for, so the quantity, then try to think about what units that quantity might be in. And then, kind of step number 3, I always actually typically will write the word given for myself. Or if I don't write it, I'll make some kind of a space, on the side. And I'll write all of the different numbers and the units, which means all the measurements that they have provided me in the question. So I try to always say, so what are they trying to give me here, right? These ones are just measurements that they are giving me in some way, or maybe, counting in some particular way. And I always write them out, even if I may not necessarily know how to solve. Now I write them out because now I'm going to have all of these different kind of givens, right? And they might be some quantities that are given to me in some way, which I'm going to try to use in some particular item. Now this one, depending on what you do. So typically, in younger grades, this isn't as much of a worry. But as you get on through later on grades, so this item in red, which is written and it says consistency, here we want to make sure that we do have our units and measurements that are consistent if we're going to be trying to solve. Now I'm going to do a kind of a little shorter separate idea video for consistency. So when it's finished, I guess I'll put up a link up above there. You can search my channel, but I'll talk about consistency and what that means. But just to give you a hint, consistency means that if you're going to be adding things up, for instance, they have to have the same unit. So if you're talking about time, and you have 1 hour plus 20 minutes, if you're going to be adding them up, you want to try to change them maybe to the same unit. All right. And if you're going to want more, you're going to be able to click on that link that I pointed out. Now, after this, after I kind of check my consistencies, then only then do I try to see, are there some formulas or equations that I can create in order to set up my actual solution. And once I do that, then I try to solve it. So, and typically solving just means, do you remember your order of operations in some way? And then finally, when I get my answer, this is not always needed, but more often than not, you're going to have to try to round. That's why kind of rounding is important to know, because you're not going to give infinite amount of decimals, or you shouldn't even give 10 decimals or 8 decimals or so on, or whatever it is on your calculator. It should be rounded in some logical way, so you should know how to round. If you forgot rounding, again, maybe I'll put up a link up above there so that you can see numerous examples on that. All right. So this is the strategy that I'm going to try to utilize in the word problems. Okay. And that's all that I'm going to say in this particular video. You can watch the rest of the videos in this playlist, or click on the links, to see a little bit more. And eventually, hopefully gonna hit on some videos which I am literally just solving, and I'm using this entire strategy, okay, to solve numerous word problems, kind of base word problems that you might have and run into. Okay, thanks for watching. See you in a future video. Bye, everybody.